So when you look at the single sign-on paradigm, it's very powerful and it works very well. And I expect it to be around for a long time. SAML is almost 20 years old and it still works great. People still use it. OpenID Connect is extremely powerful, and especially in the area of cloud platforms, it's very, very heavily used. The issues that I think have arisen and have been around for a long time fall into the categories of authentication, strong authentication, and then the other piece that is an outstanding issue that's being addressed right now in some standards work is the issue of control of your own identity.
Mobile workforces, cloud applications, and digitalization are changing every aspect of the modern enterprise. And with radical transformation come new business risks. Welcome to Hybrid Identity Protection, the premier podcast for cybersecurity pros charged with defending hybrid identity environments. Presented by Semperis, the pioneers of identity-driven cyber resilience for the hybrid enterprise. And now, here's your host, 15-time Microsoft MVP and Active Directory security expert, Sean Deuby.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the HIP Podcast. Identity standards are the locks that secure our applications and therefore our data, making sure we are who we say we are before we get into the app. Perhaps more accurately, identity standards are the types of locks. A padlock is a Kerberos ticket, a deadbolt is an OpenID Connect token, that developers count on to be sure their applications are safe. In the last decade, identity has moved from being just one facet of the overall security story to the center of the story. So these standards are critical to information security. My special guest today, Pamela Dingle, and I have been to many identity-focused conferences, notably Cloud Identity Summit, now Identiverse. She actually convinced me to cover the inaugural Cloud Identity Summit in Keystone, Colorado in 2010, in my role at the time as technical director and journalist for Windows IT Pro magazine. There were maybe 100 people there, and I didn't know a soul except for her. Now thousands of professionals attend Identiverse and Semperis' own Hybrid Identity Protection Conference, focusing identity. Today, Pam is Director of Identity Standards at Microsoft. Her typically understated bio includes phrases like identity geek, integrator, architect, strategic opinioneer, extrovert, jack of all trades. 15 plus years of experience spent putting identity-related infrastructure into large organizations, 7 years in the CTO office of a software vendor, Ping Identity, meeting customers, working on strategy and vision, participating in standards efforts. What this bio doesn't include, and should, is the phrase human router. Pam excels at collecting people, making them feel welcome and interesting, and then connecting them to other people in groups to the benefit of both. I'm proud to call her a dear friend. Welcome, Pam.
Hello, that is the best introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much.
It's probably the longest one, certainly. So tell me, what are the responsibilities of your role as Director of Identity Standards at Microsoft?
I have the best job in the entire world. So my job involves running a team, and our team works in multiple standards bodies in the industry. And when I say standards bodies, what I mean are organizations such as ISO, the International Standards Organization, or the OpenID Foundation, or W3C, which is for web types of standards. Our team basically goes into these standards bodies and into standards efforts and working groups within these standards bodies, and we represent Microsoft. We collaborate with other large companies, but also individual contributors and startups. All of us work together to try to create specifications that allow interoperability in the industry. And what I mean by that is when you think about software development in general, if you are a software company and every customer who comes to you and wants something different, you have to write code just for that customer. What happens is you get bogged down. You can't scale because you have to write customer A's proprietary edition, customer B's proprietary edition, and so on and so forth. So what standards do instead is that standards try to take common activities and then create very strong rules around how those activities work, to the point where anyone who writes to the standard, to the specification, can be successful in talking to each other. So an example of this is single sign-on, where if everybody acts in proper roles and uses this specification for SAML, then any identity provider, that is somebody playing the role of identity provider and issuing assertions and claims, can interoperate with anyone playing the relying party. And what that means is that from a software development perspective, when a customer comes and says, we need this proprietary thing X, you can tell them that they can write to the specification themselves and instantly gain interoperation with the cloud platform. Does that make sense?
It does. It reminds me of a statement that Microsoft PM Nathan Mugley made a long time ago. He said, working without standards is like trying to order pizza for 1 million people.
That's wonderful. Yeah, the easy analogy here is electricity. So when you take a light bulb and you twist it into the socket of a lamp in your house, you don't have to know what that means. You don't have to understand the electrical current flow or how strong the light bulb is or any of that piece. And the reason why is because somebody has created an abstraction layer for you that says, as long as you create a threaded screw of a certain size with certain tolerances, then electricity will flow in expected ways. That is exactly what we try to do with identity standards. We try to make it as simple as creating a threaded interface where expected data can flow back and forth.
And so what we have over time, following that electricity analogy, is we have a variety of different light bulbs that have evolved over time, from the Edison light bulb to what I was just plugging into my halogen fixtures. I think it's a GU14 or a GU10 with LED bulbs. So we do have a collection of identity standards of various ages, and they're all out there right now, and everybody is working with them depending on the age of their applications and all that. Where in their life cycles are these old and current standards? I mean, we have things as old as NTLM, we have up to as new as OpenID Connect. Where do you see all of these in the market right now?
So there are some pretty specific collections, I would say, of standards in the world right now. And, the oldest collection in many ways are the domain-specific protocols. So, things that were never designed to be secure crossing the internet. And so that's where NTLM and Kerberos and LDAP all come into the picture. And for those who aren't familiar with those specifications, what all of those things allow you to do is to communicate identity within a network perimeter. So in the case of LDAP, you can do something called a bind, which is basically, one of the first centralized authentication actions, really, where you can say, here's my distinguished name and here's my password, and I am going to bind a current query or session to a specific entity within an LDAP directory. Those kinds of things were amazing innovations for their time. But because the internet has changed what it is, and because so many companies work across domains now, those specifications, which used to be enough, are no longer sufficient.
And so we have the rise of SAML and later of OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, and they're designed to function outside of the domain boundary.
That's right. In fact, what they're designed to do is to communicate identity information or authorization information between domains. The way I think of that, there are two pieces in what you just said when you talked about OAuth and SAML and OpenID Connect. There are really two pieces. There's authorization and there's single sign-on. And it's important to understand where the differences are in those specifications. But if we're going to do the chronological evolution perspective, then really we have to move next to the cross-domain single sign-on work, and that's really SAML. The parts of SAML that have survived, this specification was, I believe, something around 800 pages long originally. The pieces of it that are still in use today are all around web single sign-on. So we're really talking about HTTPS redirects. And, the way this works, I describe it as a note from your parents. You try to get into the zoo, and the zookeeper looks at you and says, I'm sorry, I'm going to need a note from your parents. And so he sends you back home, and your mother writes you a note, and she pins it to your t-shirt, and she sends you back to the zoo, right? And the next time you arrive at the zoo, the zookeeper sees on your shirt a letter that says, dear zookeeper, little Bobby is allowed to attend the zoo. And then the zookeeper will let you in. This is sort of the idea of this, except there's a whole bunch of cryptographic verification that goes on, because it turns out that nobody wants any forgery of your mother's signature on a note to the zookeeper.
Right. And SAML has been a standard among enterprises for single sign-on for quite a while. And then we have OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect coming
Correct.
into the fore.
Correct. And, all of these things evolve for a reason. And the reason why OpenID Connect and OAuth evolved past, at a time when SAML was becoming very popular, really was because the SAML profiles were browsers and HTTPS. And at the time that OAuth came along, this was really the advent of cloud platforms and API-driven cloud platforms. And so all of a sudden, it was no longer the case that web applications were the only game in town. There were now API-driven mobile applications. At the same time that this need for mobile applications calling APIs came around, we also ended up in a world where REST as a philosophy was taking over from XML as far as data formats. So there were a number of sort of evolutionary processes that were going on at the time when OAuth was created. Now, the thing to understand about OAuth versus OpenID Connect, this is where we get into authorization versus single sign-on. When I talk about SAML, I'm really talking about a secure introduction, right? The note from your parents, you're sent somewhere with an introduction, and once you're introduced, then you go off and do your business. And that works in cases where there's web sessions involved. But in cases where it's an API, we're in a different state, because now you have a mobile app that's running. Perhaps it's looking up your tweets. And that app is running regardless of whether you're using the application or not. So it's sitting in the background, and it's updating your tweets and updating your tweets and updating your tweets. And so the concept of a web session was invalid for this new concept of calling a cloud platform and calling APIs. And so, there were new needs, and OAuth evolved to meet those needs. And the way that OAuth evolved was essentially to create the concept of, in this case, an access token. And the way that OAuth works as far as an access token is that when the user is present, so at the time where the user is actively working with the application, the user will prove who they are. And then what gets issued is instead of a secure introduction, what gets issued is essentially a valet key, right? It's a token that is expected to be used over and over again out of the presence of the user. Mm. And so that token gets issued to your mobile application, and then boom, you're making your API calls tens, hundreds, thousands of times until that access expires. And then you have to go back to the well. You have to get your user back involved, and you have to get another one of these access tokens. So none of that involves identity. None of it.
One of my favorite graphics is one of those meme generators is Samuel L. Jackson from Pulp Fiction. And he's holding the gun at the drug dealer, and he's saying, "Say OAuth is an authentication standard one more time. Go ahead. I dare you. I double dare you."
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So where does OIDC fit in this?
OpenID Connect is, in fact, the identity layer that can sit on top of OAuth. So the way I like to say it is that, the identity part of OAuth is really that moment when you're in touch with the user, when the user is present and proving who they are. In that moment, you in fact may want to convey identity information to your client, to your mobile application, for example. what OpenID Connect does is adds a second token. So the access token is a token that's really meant for your mobile apps to be able to call APIs over and over again. The token that OpenID Connect adds to the same hop, right, because it's a layer on top of OAuth, the second token is called an ID token, and it is a secure introduction. So now what happens is when your mobile app makes the request to get access to APIs, it receives an assertion that looks a lot like a SAML assertion and says, hey, this is Pamela Dingle. Pamela Dingle is scoped to use these things, and here's her first name and last name. So it adds claims. It also adds information about the authentication context. So it's possible the client might want to know that, in fact, what happened when the user proved their identity was that they went through multi-factor authentication. And so all of that information gets put into a token called an ID token. And that piece is really the OpenID, the guts of OpenID Connect.
You're focused on, or you're spending a lot of your time focusing on emerging standards. And of course, the standards, as you say, with OpenID Connect and OAuth 2, and you've explained the shortcomings of existing standards that are giving rise to OAuth and OpenID Connect. What are some other emerging standards that you're involved in that are solving problems that we still have today, such as passwords and various portable forms of identity?
Yes, there's so much fun stuff going on right now. It's not even funny. So when you look at the single sign-on paradigm, it's very powerful and it works very well. And I expect it to be around for a long time. SAML is almost 20 years old. Maybe it is 20 years old. It's right on the cusp. And it still works great. People still use it. OpenID Connect is extremely powerful. And especially in the area of cloud platforms, it's very, very heavily used. The issues that I think have arisen and have been around for a long time fall into the categories of authentication, strong authentication. And then the other piece that is an outstanding issue that's being addressed right now in some standards work is the issue of control of your own identity. So if we start with that one, really, we go back to the zookeeper example. There you are trotting off with a note from your mother pinned to your chest. Well, it turns out that we're not actually toddlers, and we don't always want somebody else to speak on our behalf. And the question becomes, what if I don't want my mother to have to write me a note for every single zoo I want to talk to? Well, can we change that paradigm? And the answer is yes. We can, for example, have your mother write a note that is essentially to whom it may concern and hand it to their child, and then give their child the control to hand that to whom it may concern note to whoever they deem worthy. And the advantage of doing that is very, very interesting. So the first off, suddenly now your mother does not know all the places that you're visiting. You get to have privacy in that sense that you can give your note to whoever you want for whatever your reasons. So there's a nice disassociation there that you get from being able to control what we would call the presentation, right? The presentation of that credential to someone who will verify it and give you access to something. So that's exciting when you think about it, but it has upsides, but it also does have downsides. It means that it's your responsibility now not to lose that note, right? Instead of it being pinned to your chest and all of the counterfeiting measures being out of your control, now you have to be sure that you can manage this credential and that it won't get lost and all of these things. And so there's some accountability and some responsibility that go along with this ability to control who you present credentials to. But it's exciting. And the standards effort that I'm really talking about here is decentralized identity, sometimes also referred to as self-sovereign identity. And the real specification that enables this to happen is actually a data format called verifiable credentials. And that spec is ratified. It was created in the W3C. And there's a world of additional specifications that swirl around the concept of verifiable credentials that allow you to have essentially a root of trust that can be anchored in different ways. And, again, with, when we talk about the things that are evolving in the world, one of the things that have changed is the mainstream understanding of blockchains. And so one of the ways you can own and control your own identity would be to store your cryptographic keys on a blockchain. And the reason why many people think that's interesting is because once you write a blockchain entry, it is what's considered immutable, meaning that nobody can take it away from you. If you think about an identity provider, you could create your own identity provider. You could be a SAML identity provider, or you could be an OpenID Connect OpenID provider, but you're running a domain. And if you lose that domain, in 100 years, someone else will likely own that domain. Whereas if you anchor to the blockchain of some kind, some decentralized ledger that meets your particular philosophical beliefs, then in theory, your keys will still be there in 100 years. And again, upsides and downsides. But that is really one of the fundamental things that is emerging right now, this concept that I could have a public key that no one can take away, that I can use to prove, make assertions about myself, or to control the presentation of credentials that have been issued by others. I get to control who sees them, who they are given to.
When will we start to see this in everyday life? Since decentralized identity seems to apply very much to the individual and the consumer as well as the enterprise.
It's a really good question. I don't know that I know the answer. There is a lot to do for this to go mainstream. I think that one of the interesting places right now where this could be brought to the mainstream is in Europe. There's a place called the ESIF Labs, ESSIF, ESIF Labs. They are working on, they're doing work now that could possibly be picked up as part of the regulatory fabric of the EU. Now that may not happen, but a lot of people are investigating this technology right now. I think it's safe to say that a lot of the EU bodies are contemplating it. I don't want to name any because I would feel terrible if I was, if I incorrectly named them. Sure. But, certainly Microsoft is investing and interested in this area. There are multiple foundations that have sprung up around this. If you are interested in finding out more, you can look at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which is identity.foundation. That's the web URL. There is Trust Over IP, which I think is toip.org, but I could be wrong there. There's really multiple sort of centers of gravity in this area, and they all have a slightly different take on how this should work and why it's important.
But clearly, the need is very broadly recognized, which is the reason that everybody is so interested in it.
Yes. I will say that, one of the areas that has a lot of very active participation and interest is in the education world. So, a diploma is an example of a credential that generally gets issued to a user, and then the user has responsibility for presenting it to those they want to present it to. For example, in the case when you're applying for a job, or if you want to apply for a visa. And that idea of educational skills, proving your certifications, this is definitely an area where I predict you would start to see mainstream decentralized identity interactions.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. I was just realizing as you were talking about SAML, to bring this full circle, that you are actually the one that first described that SAML dance to me these many years ago. I don't think you had the zoo analogy, which I really like, and I will abscond it and use it as well going forward. So
that's right. My analogies are evolving over time.
Well, of course, yes. So thank you for coming. Will you, when you have new things to talk about, when you had some new, we haven't talked at all about WebAuthn or any of the things that may transform the way people authenticate on their mobile devices. Will you come back and we can talk about that?
I would love to talk just about WebAuthn. I think it's a really important part of how the intranet will evolve in the next 10 years.
Well, so, with that hook, how can we not come back and talk about it?
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Pam, very much. Thanks for your time. I know you are a back-to-back meeting person, but I appreciate you taking the time to sort of sync us up with identity standards, where they've come from and where they're going.
Thanks for joining us on the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast with Sean Deuby. Be sure to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. Visit hipconf.com. That's HIPCONF.com to learn about upcoming events, view expert presentations, and take part in the conversation.